Hey guys, a few months ago I made a lore video titled Children of the Abyss, tying the overall themes of Dark Souls to Buddhist thought regarding the nature of existence. Since then I've spoken to lots of people about my ideas and I've received a whole range of responses ranging from curiosity, support and complete disbelief. Some even accused me of trolling. The original video was told in a storybook format and I thought it might be a good idea if I put my thoughts into a more direct way to make them more accessible. I'll begin by explaining the basic tenets of Buddhism. Buddhism encompasses a variety of traditions and beliefs based on the teachings of Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. His teachings revolved around what have since become known as the Four Noble Truths: that life is suffering, that the cause of suffering is desire, that the only way to escape suffering is to give up desire, and that the only way to escape is to follow the Buddha's path. Buddhists believe clinging and craving to temporary states and things, known as anicca, is ultimately unsatisfactory and painful, and leads to the repeated cycles of rebirth and redeath, known as samsara. By following the noble path, craving and clinging can be confined, peace of mind and real happiness can be attained, ending the cycle of samsara and achieving nirvana. Now, the term nirvana is well known in Western culture and is associated with the concept of heaven or paradise. But in actual fact, nirvana is far less a place than a state of being. Literally meaning to blow out, as in blowing out a candle or an oil lamp, nirvana represents the liberation from the endless cycle of death and rebirth, whereby the individual moves into a state of no self. When they achieve nirvana, an individual is said to have blown out their sense of self, anatta, and then they become empty, sunyata. So what does all this have to do with Dark Souls? Well, my theory is this. The story of Dark Souls is actually an allegory for the individual's journey to escape the endless cycles of life and rebirth, and eventually reach nirvana. Now, at first this might seem far-fetched, but let me lay out my case, and if you believe me, great, leave a like. If not, just tell me in the comments what you think of my ideas. Let's start with the discovery of the Lord Souls by the gods and their subsequent war against the Archdragons. With the gods' victory began the so-called Age of Fire. We're not sure when, but sometime after this Lord Gwyn was forced to link the fire, an act that precipitated the events of the first Dark Souls. When we begin the first game, our player character suffers from the curse of the undead, an affliction that causes humans to continually return from death at the bonfires we see strewn across the world. Each time the player dies, we start again from the last bonfire we rested at. The only way to end this cycle is to reach the end of the game, at which point we either link the fire ourselves or abandon it to begin the Age of Dark. We don't know the full consequences of either action because the game doesn't explain them, so it's left to our imagination somewhat. However, by the events of Dark Souls 2, it's become clear that the canon ending of linking the fire didn't end the curse of the undead. In fact, it seems that the linking is in fact a cycle itself, whereby the power of the flame diminishes over time, so that with each new age, more undead, trapped in their own cycles of death and rebirth, are needed to link the flame again. So there's a lesser cycle of the undead dying and returning at bonfires, and the greater cycle of the flame dying and being relinked to restart the Age of Fire. We can think of both cycles, especially the perpetual death and rebirth of the undead, as an allusion to the endless cycle of samsara. I want to discuss the idea of hollowing. It is said that after too many deaths, an undead can lose his sense of purpose and then lose his mind completely, becoming hollow and immune to reason. Hollows can be found everywhere in the Souls games and attack on sight. The player character can become hollow in the game. In Dark Souls 1 and 2 it happens on death, but one can also reverse hollowing by offering humanity at a bonfire. We know that the Dark Soul was taken by the furtive pygmy, and since then the Dark Soul are split and is carried by all humans. But what about the undead and hollows? Do they carry the Dark Soul? Before I answer this question, I want to talk about what the Dark Soul and all the other Lord Souls actually represent. We know that before the finding of the Lord Souls the world was grey, so before fire the world was unchanging. There may not even have been a concept of death. But then came fire, and fire brought with it disparity, heat and cold, life and death, light and dark. Then came the beings that found the souls of power. From the dark they came, and found the souls of lords within the flame. Look closely here at the creatures walking towards the fire. They're almost zombie-like in the way they move. They move almost randomly, like flies drawn to a flame, and while it's not much to go on, I'm sure it shows that before the fire and the Lord Souls, men were hollow. For me, this revelation was a watershed moment. For years I believed that hollowing was a tragic end to a life. I thought that when an individual goes hollow, they lose their sense of self and go mad. This may technically be true, but it's a misunderstanding of what's actually going on. Hollowing is the true form of man, and those that go hollow are simply reverting to their natural state after being emptied of the substance that changed them in the first place, the dark soul. We can find evidence for this in the game mechanics. As I mentioned earlier, in order to change from hollow form to human, one must offer humanity at a bonfire. And what is humanity? Just a tiny piece of the Dark Soul. Hollowing also appears in Dark Souls 3, but works differently. In Dark Souls 3, hollowing is achieved by collecting the dark sigils, which accumulate with every death. With each sigil your hollowing increases. But what is a dark sigil? Well, it's described as a black gaping hole in the flesh, from which the darkness of humanity seeps. So it seems that the dark sigil allows humanity, aka the dark soul, to seep from the player, leaving them hollow. The point is that in both games we see that it's the dark soul that makes men human, and in its absence they take the form of hollows. Now recall that the word nirvana means to blow out, or to empty oneself. And what is a hollow other than a being that has emptied itself? This has significant implications regarding the nature of the dark soul itself. In Buddhism they speak of the three fires that cause pain in this world. Raga, which is greed and sensuality, Dvesha, which is aversion and hate, and Moha, which is ignorance and delusion. To put it simply, the root of our unhappiness is our desires. And I believe that the Lord Souls represent the attainment of reason and clarity, which in turn generate desire. And before finding the Lord Souls, the beings from the dark were hollow, but the souls gave them a sense of self, and with the sense of self came desire and all the good and bad desire brings. So in a sense, the humans of Dark Souls are caught in a literal version of the cycle of samsara, whereby as undead, they are trapped in an eternal cycle of death and resurrection in a vain attempt to achieve their desire, to link the flame. But of course, like all desires, this is a trap. Linking the flame doesn't end the cycle, just perpetuates it for another generation. So the question becomes, how does one escape the cycle? How does one achieve nirvana? It didn't start to make sense until I met the locust preacher in the Ring City.
Many of us are by the fire, forsaken. I speak of thine kind and mine. Behold this city. We are kindred, but like two eyes which gaze upon the other. Fear not the dark, my friend, and let the feast begin.
He appears in various locations, and in each subsequent iteration recounts the tale of various NPCs we met throughout the game.
One poor girl slew her own kin, but even so was embraced, enveloped by the abyss. One met the dark with learning, but in the end learned his knowledge was wanting. And so she lived in fear of the dark, of the things that gnawed at her flesh. And so, despite his weighty armor, he lived in fear of a delicate thing. One was a wayfaring knight on an endless, forbidden search.
Here's what's interesting about these NPCs. All of them, on completion of their quest, became hollow, and more importantly, the preacher heavily implies that on becoming hollow, they ended up in the abyss.
But even so, was embraced, enveloped by the abyss. 'Twas a comfort that neither moon nor sunless sky afforded her. His knowledge was wanting. The world began without knowledge, and without knowledge will it end. Does not this ring clear and true on an endless, forbidden search? Only the abyss granted closure, if not reunion with his beloved.
This was another revelation. Why would hollows travel to the abyss? What's in the abyss for them? And why are the preachers inviting us to do the same? Throughout the series, the abyss has been portrayed as a foreboding force. The gods feared it, so much so that they flooded the city of New London to contain its power.
And do not forget, the dark wraiths reside in a dark void called the abyss. They were born in New Londo, and that is where they perished. The entire city was sacrificed to contain them, for that is how great a threat they were.
And in the time of Knight Artorias, the abyss spread forth and blighted the land of Ulasil and corrupted Artorias himself.
But the abyss is no place for ordinary mortals, although, long ago, the knight Artorias traversed the abyss. If you can find him and learn from him, the abyss may prove surmountable.
So playing the games, one would be left with the impression that the abyss was something to be feared. But is that really true, or have we misunderstood it? We learn a lot of things in the Ring City, but some of the most significant are learned from the Ring Knights, because their armour and weapons are all said to have been forged in the abyss. Clearly the Ring Knights, who were early men, had a close affinity for the abyss. They forged their weapons in it, and they were trying to see it through the cloth tainted by the abyss itself. But why? Once again the answer lies in the opening sequence of Dark Souls 1.
Then from the dark they came, and found the souls of lords within the flame.
From the dark they came, and found the souls of lords within the flame. No one ever asks what the dark is. I now believe this dark is the darkness of the abyss. The abyss was home to all humans before the advent of fire. This explains the preacher's dialogue, and our human form is an artificial state instigated by the power of the Lord Souls, and when that power inevitably fades, we slowly return to our natural state, hollowness, and in our hollow form we seem to yearn to return to the abyss, which would explain why hollows seemingly lash out at anything or anyone that approaches them. They haven't gone mad, they're just a fish out of water flailing about desperately in an environment they don't understand. It was said that the Buddha achieved 2 states of nirvana. The first was at enlightenment, known as nirvana with a remainder, and the second was at his death, known as nirvana without remainder, as in there is nothing left. I believe hollowing represents the first stage of nirvana, with remainder, and nirvana without remainder is not death, but a reunion with the abyss, where all humans came from and where they must return. So only in the abyss can one achieve a state of true tranquility. By emptying oneself of the dark soul, you can return to the dark itself, finally breaking the endless cycle of the undead curse, finally reaching nirvana.